Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. And thanks to the Center for Asia Pacific Studies for setting up this talk. Looking at my title, you might, like this whale floating on the mountains, be wondering what's going on with mountain whales. We usually think of them as in the water, not up in the mountains, or thinking about this in the context of my book title, you might be wondering what I mean by bringing whales ashore. And while I could talk for quite a long time about different aspects of the book, the one I want to focus on today is a central argument about what marine environmental history can look like if you consider the tension between the oceans and the land, between coastal whales and mountain whales, if you want to think of it that way. And for that, you need to think about how you actually get whales ashore, how far they go, and where they go. And so one underlying question is kind of how much does this one animal matter? And while you might be most familiar with Japanese interactions with whales in the late 20th, early 21st century, when environmentalist groups such as Greenpeace and Sea Shepherds have worked in opposition to the practice of modern Japanese whaling, the earlier history of whales in Japan doesn't just provide context for this problem today. It also shows, at least I hope, how important the ocean can be and has been in areas that might seem to be disconnected from this one fishery. Of course, there's plenty of people who study the history of whaling and have done some fantastic work on different nations throughout history and their whaling practices. But what I wanted to do with my project was to see if I couldn't do just a bit more than add to whaling history. And this, what you see here on the screen is a large folding screen that the first part went by really fast, but has very little land. The land part is just this corner of it. And it shows whaling groups operating sometime in the Tokugawa period, there's no date on the screen, in the waters off of the Kumano coast in what is now Wakayama Prefecture. And maps like this one clearly show marine space as far more central to people's consciousness than the land. This is easily less than a third of this entire screen that's showing land, and the focus is really on these little boats that are out there in the water, and you can see whale tails, and they're surrounding a whale, and down in the lower left corner you can see the whaling group pulling the whale up on the beach and processing it. So despite this one version showing us how much oceans mattered, in general, the histories of the Japanese archipelago have tended not to talk much about the oceans. The geographical shorthand for Japan kind of is a list of islands, right? So early modern Japan, the Tokugawa or the Edo period, if it's by dynasty or however you want to frame that as 1603 to 1868, early modern Japan. For my book, I was rounding it off to 1600 to 1900. But you have Honshu, you have Shikoku, you have Kyushu, at least before the end of the 19th century, the addition of Hokkaido and the Ryukyu Islands after that point. But of course, this picture is more complicated once you get into the modern era and the height of Japan's colonial ambitions. But even then, this archipelago is the heart of the country, and it shouldn't just be the land parts that are highlighted here, right? The political histories of the Tokugawa period tend to focus on terrestrial boundaries. And I think one of the reasons why this rice-centered agriculture that you see here, with Mount Fuji showing, emblematic Japanese history, forgets the ocean space. And that's why I wanted to look at ways to think about, well, here's some rice fields, but look, they're right next to the ocean. What's going on over there? Are they connected? How are they connected? And when we identify Japan as just the terrestrial part of the islands that make up the archipelago, and it makes fisheries a specialist thing that isn't part of mainstream history. It makes other aspects of interactions with marine space exceptional rather than folded into a picture that should include the water space of the archipelago as well as the terrestrial space. And of course, this viewpoint comes in part from a long-standing way of doing history inherited from China, where the Confucian construction of what history should be is centered on farmers and rice agriculture. And there's people who have considered many different ways that we could break this apart and do different forms of history. And I want to shift our attention towards the influence of coastal waters, especially in the Tokugawa period, because there was not much interaction across the oceans. We know that it wasn't totally closed. There was some connection, but that doesn't mean that there was no interaction with the oceans. Coastal waters were, as you can see in this image, quite lively with shipping, with fishing, with other things going on. And so by looking at whales and tracing where people interacted with them, where the parts of whales ended up, what people thought about them, I wanted to show one way that we can rethink putting coastal space into our understanding of what Japan looks like in this period. And I do think that looking at the ocean offers more than just oh, this is a less studied part of history. This is from Jeff Bolster, who is one of the people who got marine environmental history started in conversations about adding the marine to environmental history. And he was saying historians need to look at how human maritime communities were embedded in non-human marine communities and what that meant for the course of history. And I actually want to change this to say non-human marine communities were embedded in human communities. It's not just ones that are maritime, that are in ports, that are out on the water. How far do they go, right? And I found when I was tracing whales around, they actually go pretty far. So if we're looking at early modern Japan, what do we think about for this space? I'd like to add in at least the coastal sections, right? The space of water should be part of this boundary. And what's in that? What can we get by thinking about that? It's not just looking for details of whaling groups and a whaling history. It's trying to think about maritime intersections and terrestrial intersections and what this all means. So whaling groups are where I started, and major oceanic currents bring all kinds of marine life close to the shores of especially Western Japan. And so you see here the Kuroshio current and the Tsushima current, which breaks off from the Kuroshio a little south of this map, are major drivers of the vigorous marine life that people have been relying on in Japan for a very long time. Fish and nutrients and all the things that eat them, including whales, are moving along this current. And so in the red circles on the map, with the numbers in them, those are places which are regions which developed organized whaling groups during the Tokugawa period. And they started in number 1 in Ise and Mikawa Bays, and people moved down the coast, along the Kumano coast is number 2, and then to Tosa and in Shikoku, and also into all of the little islands off of Kyushu, and a little bit up and around the corner following the Tsushima current. And so all of these places are places where there were whales migrating back and forth along the coast close enough that people didn't have to go out of sight of land in order to catch them. And so what you end up with is a space where there's a lot going on. And this is not Japan, as you see in this image here. There's histories of what is important for Europe that include shipping, that include thinking about lively coastal space and bustling industrial areas, and transition into modern container shipping, right? So this is just an example, Newcastle Harbor, shortly after or near the end of the period I was looking at, lots and lots of ships, but a lot of that is considered to be global trade. And so it might make sense that people aren't thinking about trade as much when it's only funneling into Nagasaki. But one of the things that happened in Western culture is as you shifted over into fewer crews on sailing ships and into these cargo vessels, and from the previous picture, you also developed a leisure practice of sailing, of boating, of swimming, right? And so you had another way that instead of working on the water, as fewer people were working on the water, you ended up with people playing on the water. And you don't see that as much in Japan. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've kind of forgotten to look for this history that has maritime space, that has marine environmental connections to it. So here's an example that's somewhat recent. It's from 2002 when I was in Hakodate. And this is a city, at the time it was around 285,000 people. And if you look at the harbor, there's a big cargo shipping area on both sides of the city, some really good harbors. And you can see that on the left side of this panorama. But this tiny little section down at the bottom of this harbor, and you can see zoomed in here, the top picture, these are all the recreational boats for this massive city. And I was there, and I'm from the East Coast, New England, where you go to harbors and you expect to see them more like this, packed full of sailboats and motorboats. And this is just one of 6 marinas in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, which has a population much smaller than Hakodate, but many, many more boats, many more people going down there. And so there's more of a consciousness of an intersection between the marine environment and people living on land. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we've forgotten to look for this in Japan, because harbors in Japan, and this is down in, this one is down in Kyushu, I think. This is an old town that was a whaling, not even city, town. And you can see a couple fishing boats on this really artificial wharf here, but it's not the same level of interaction. And so it's a much more specialized thing. It's not everybody who understands this space or goes out into it. And that's for the modern era. This is the Kumano coast. It's really not very hospitable looking. There's a big storm had been coming through, but this happens a lot because it's open to the Pacific Ocean. It's very rocky. And so therefore, it doesn't automatically seem like a space that's really important. But if you go back to the screen I was showing you, this is also the Kumano coast. There's a lot of boats out there. There's a lot of people out there. There's people who actually are moving in that space much more frequently than they are on land. And so one of the things that I discovered as I was following whales around is that we need to mentally repopulate this coastal water space and think about it as a connection where the people were using. So what were they doing? What are they catching whales? They were catching right whales. Initially, those are right whales are the right ones to hunt kind of all over the world. And they then also, after they first started doing organized whaling, which was, as I mentioned, in the Ise and Mikawa Bay area, they started to change their techniques. So about 50 years after they really expanded in around 1620, in 1675, I think it was, I might be getting that date not quite right, but they had an invention of adding nets into the process so that they could also catch humpback whales and gray whales, which are slightly faster swimmers. So you have to entangle them in a net to slow them down so that you can harpoon them and catch them. And so as people adapted to figuring out new ways to catch whales, they also changed the species that they were catching and the places they were able to catch them. And then they also sometimes would catch other kind of rarer whales by accident, but these are, the major species that they were looking for. And so what do they do with them? They would process these whales. You can see in the upper right, there's the whales they're caught out in the water. The nets are floating and they haul them ashore. So you can see the net is being pulled off the back of the whale while they sort of cut the blubber off on the beach. And they are mostly focused on getting oil and meat and baleen from whales. Baleen is from a specific set of whales called baleen whales that don't have teeth. Instead, they have keratin, so like fingernails that grows out of their jaws, and they get a big scoop of water in their mouth and they press their tongue up against the baleen and press the food against the baleen. The water squeezes out between it. They scrape the stuff off and swallow it. And then they also have very large amounts of oil, mostly from the fatty blubber layer around the whale. And then obviously the meat is the same as many other animals. So this brings me back to the mountain whales. You got all these pieces, all these parts, and I was trying to trace, okay, these are the products, who's selling them, who's buying them, who's consuming them. And I ran across this concept of mountain whales, which I think is really good representation of how far, at least the idea of whales traveled. The whales were not swimming up into the mountains. Whale meat sellers, like this one you see here, little peddlers with small packets of whale meat, would travel quite far by foot out from villages that were on the coast, chopping up the whales after they'd hunted them, and would sell them in the local region. But some of them did walk up into the mountains and sell them. But actually, mountain whale is more often boar. It's wild boar that they are advertising as yamakujira, as mountain whale. And so the whales are not traveling that far up into the mountains. Whale meat spoils relatively fast, even if you boil it or salt it. And so much further away from where the whaling villages are, people are thinking about eating whale and thinking that that's a valued thing to do, even if it's not actually whale. And I think tracing, well, but why would they want to call it that? What are they thinking? What's going on there? Is an important part of figuring out the impact of having this connection with coastal waters. And the short version of this is that there's a hierarchy of animals in Buddhist conceptions of what you might be reincarnated into, right? And there's different levels of pollution from having killed different types of these animals. So if you kill an ant, it's not as big a deal as if you kill a deer, right? Something like that. And it so happens that some of that is based on outward form rather than our current understandings of like mammals being closer to humans. So whales were considered to be fish, which were less of a problem than eating four-legged animals like boar. And so you could eat mountain whale and you could go visit a shrine, which yes, is Shinto, but Shinto and Buddhism were very mixed together in this period. And as a samurai who had to follow certain taboos of cleanliness, when you do this, you could visit more quickly after having eaten mountain whale, if it was whale, than after having eaten boar. So there's things like this that tell us a lot when you start tracing them down about what they're thinking about different spaces and animals and things like that. There's other ways that whales and whale-related knowledge show up in interesting places. Agriculture is one of them. So if you're thinking about rice agriculture as the center of Japanese society, whales still show up there. So this picture is on the right-hand side, an image from an agricultural manual, which is describing how to spread whale oil on the rice as an insecticide. So to prevent insect damage on the rice crop, including the kinds of insect damage that caused some of the major famines of the period. And so in this manual, they also have these pages on the upper left here showing what the whale species look like. So there's no reason when you're using this oil that you would have to know what a whale is like. And these diagrams of the whale's anatomy and how you tell the difference between a sperm whale, which is the top one, and a humpback whale and a right whale. But this kind of curiosity about what is this oil we're using, this knowledge about whales was circulating within farmers who had maybe never seen one and therefore wanted this picture. And also, I was interested to discover that this is really good natural history knowledge. Like these, I, without even reading the labels for what species they are, could recognize what these whales are. And you don't usually see the whole body like this when they're just swimming along. So this requires an understanding up close and personal. When you bring the whales up on the beach, this is what they look like, right? So it's showing that there really is an interest, and it's not just specialized, obscure knowledge that people are creating in these whaling groups. And there's also more kind of fanciful versions of this information. It's not just practical scientific style information. There's also, as you can see on the right-hand side here, or yes, right-hand side, sort of fables, comic stories about whales. So in this case, it's a character who is a whale, and they're showing the whale, the head, it looks like a whale, and the body is a human walking around. I found a couple of different versions of these sorts of stories that make use of the kinds of assumptions that people had about what whales were and how they operated to tell stories that were widely circulated and published. You also have illustrated scrolls like this one that are showing different parts of the whales and different things about the species. But sometimes those scrolls that the name, or at least the label on the front, says it's 6 species of whales or things like that. This is from the same scroll as that whale. It's clearly a manta ray. It is not a whale. They were categorized, I think, at the time as a strange kind of fish, right? So other strange kinds of fish, including sometimes sea turtles and things that are just not fishy at all, were in this category. So what people were doing is they were exploring the interesting and unusual. They were exploring the almost mythical or the fanciful aspects of their world. And by following that, you see the ways that some of this strangeness really was embedded in coastal waters, and people were becoming familiar with that. You also get medical intersections. So this is an anatomical diagram, which actually sparked off my entire book project. I started with this image and tried to figure out what was going on with it, and it blew up from there. And I still don't know enough about what's going on with it compared to what I want to know what's going on. We know that this was created, or we don't know who created this image. This is on a scroll, which is mostly these open diagrams. You see the tails of the whales on the side there, showing different species, and it's one of these 6 species of whales scrolls, but happens to include this anatomical diagram of a right whale in the middle of it. We know it was copied by somebody named Bega. We don't know who created it or why that was copied. And we know the copy is from 1847, but not how far back the original picture went. But clearly there were some people, possibly some Honzogaku scholars or natural historian people, who were working with domain lords who were wanting to know about what kinds of natural resources they had, but also sometimes got curious in their own ways about how this intersected with things like Dutch learning, which was importing anatomy textbooks for humans. In Europe, anatomical study was including dissecting lots of different kinds of animals. And so anatomical books could include human anatomy and things like mink and fish and cats and other things. But during this period, you see human anatomical diagrams and whale anatomy. Nobody else. So it's very interesting to think about why whales are the ones that we have these diagrams for. And again, this is the kind of thing that you can't just stand there on the beach while somebody's chopping up a whale and get a really good picture of where all the organs go. It's messy. It's very hard to do. So somebody put a lot of work into understanding what these animals are like. And that tells us something about how important this fishery, at least, and probably by extension, other fisheries and other information coming from the oceans was. So just to give you a quick what are these whaling groups doing summary, we have the first stage I mentioned, started in 1570 to 1620 or so, when it was expanding out along the coast. You have these harpoon groups. So they're going out in small open rowboats. They're surrounding the whale. They're throwing harpoons at it to have it sort of get tired out and slow down until somebody can finally leap onto its back and stab it for the death blow. This is very difficult and not always very successful. And so on top of that, they first managed to do it in Ise-Mikawa Bay, where the whales are more constrained. And then as that population was diminishing, either because they were hunting out all the whales, maybe the whales were learning to avoid the bay, some combination of those, it's unclear. The whalers moved down following these lines along the coast to these different bases where they operated out of to try to hunt the migrating whales. And by the time they got down to Taiji, down near the bottom of the peninsula, they had people who were starting to figure out new ways to try to catch whales. So in Taiji, somebody invented this concept of net whaling in the 1670s, where you have the same open rowboats, but also these other boats that you can see, the net boats with a sort of gold on the sides. that would hold each of them would hold an end of the net that was suspended in the water column. And these other boats would make a lot of noise and drive the whale into the net that was just floating in the water and wrap it all up, slow it down, harpoon and stab the whale and bring it back to the beach. So this allowed them to change where they were whaling and what species they were whaling. You can see in the very back of this picture, maybe the little tiny person next to a flag that would be signaling to the boats and directing them, coordinating this whole process, trying to make sure that everybody knew where the whale was and where they needed to be. That's why the boats have numbers on the side so that they could see from afar which ones were doing what. And so the locations of whaling groups map that I'd shown you before, it shows them moving with these new techniques down, looking for new unexploited whale populations. And one of the things that tells us, if you know something about Tokugawa history, it's kind of a surprise that they're moving between domains. In fact, they actually had some whalers from Taiji move temporarily to Shikoku and to Kyushu, do a whaling season there, teach people how to do it, and then come back. So they were doing migratory labor way outside of their domain boundaries in this time when supposedly peasants were staying within their domain boundaries. And so the law about where you were able to go may not actually have matched the behavior of how people were operating, especially when they were on the water. And it's very easy to move between places without being able to have a toll booth or some other thing that's keeping track of who's going where. And the domains actually supported this movement because they're bringing money in for the domains. Other things that I found in tracing where whales are going is a more less physical aspects and more both spiritual and intellectual, imaginary aspects. And so one thing that people did is they paid respect to the spirits or souls of dead whales, including, at the most extreme example, Buddhist ceremonies, just like human funeral ceremonies, to give whales posthumous Buddhist names and do memorial services to help that soul along the path of reincarnation. So on the left-hand side here, you see a whale death register that is recording those posthumous names for individual whales that were caught by the whaling group that was operating in the town that Koganji was in. And this is the only one that has, it's just whales. There are other ones that have regular death registers with occasional whale names in them. And later on, you sometimes see animals showing up in death registers like this, but usually the names are more clearly unique to animals. Sometimes it's a horse or something like that was valuable. Sometimes it's a pet that a monk had, and then they get scratched out because of that, like, oh no, you shouldn't have actually given your cat a posthumous name. But this whales seem to have been taken much more seriously as beings that had to be folded into the concept of the afterlife. And so you can, in some sense, if you're thinking spatially, the spiritual landscape went stretched out into the ocean. Right? It wasn't land people and then those other weird things. These were folded into the same space that we were living and dying in. Whales also had other ways that they showed up, and you can ask me about them in the Q&A period, but I just wanted to give you a sample of some of the different examples of where I was tracing them up into the mountains and down the coastlines and into temples and into literature and other places like that. And in looking at all of that together, what I really found is that whales were bringing the marine environment to the Japanese people throughout the archipelago. So yes, obviously fishermen who lived in fishing villages were living with the marine environment, but by having people who were going out there catching whales, dismantling the whales, sending their parts off. Sometimes the whale oil could go hundreds of miles. So whale oil from Kyushu was sent to Osaka. Right? There's ways in which people who knew nothing about what was happening in the whaling groups were being impacted by this process and were participating in this integration of the marine environment, or at least one animal that was living in it, throughout all of Japan. Not every single person, every single place, but I think enough to make a good case for thinking about the coastal space as being Japan. Right? That we can't ignore what's going on there and think just the terrestrial stuff is important. So that is the argument that I ended up with after having just initially started with this whale anatomical diagram and thinking, what's going on here? What do we do with this? What can we learn from this? And so I think if we think about early modern Japan, I want you to now think of it not just with the water around the land, right? So it's Japan is including this watery space, but remember the whales are in there and they're swimming up into the mountains, or at least imagined as being there, even though it's wild boars. They're stitching people together in interesting ways. And so this is my new version of early modern Japan for you to think about.